Okay guys, here we go. 4.4 is going to be about trig functions of any angle, and essentially what that means is we are changing our radius from 1, which is like what we've had in the unit circle, so now our radius is not going to be 1, which changes our trig functions a little bit. And then we'll talk about how to find the quadrant of an angle, and we'll use that to then develop problems or answer problems and apply for any other sort of information where we're not given both an x or a y. Okay, so first thing that we need to make sure we talk about, since our radius is no longer 1, we need to figure out how to find our radius. So we're going to have some point xy, and to find our radius, we're going to say y squared, x squared plus y squared, and that's going to equal r squared. So when you're given a point, you plug in x and y, solve, and that will give you r. And the reason we need r is because, so this would be with radius r, sine is no longer, like I said, going to be just y because our radius isn't 1. It's actually going to be y over r. Cosine, similarly, won't be just x, it'll be x over r. A nice thing here is that tangent stays the same, that's just going to be y over x still. And our other three functions that we've talked about are still going to maintain as reciprocals. So cosecant would end up as r over y, secant would end up as r over x, and cotangent is still x over y. An application problem where you might see this is if you're given the point -3, -5. So we'd have to start by finding your radius. So we're going to have -3 squared plus -5 squared, and that would be r squared. Remember, when you put this in your calculator, you need to make sure you put these in parentheses. So we would end up with 9 plus 25 is going to give us 34, and that equals r squared, and so r would be the square root of 34. And don't forget, usually we say plus or minus the square root here, but since we know we're dealing with the radius and our radius has to be positive because it's talking about a distance, we just need to use our positive version. Finding our 6 functions and sine, remember, is y over r. So -5 is our y value over the r value we just found, square root of 34. Cosine is our x value over our r value, so -3 over square root of 34. And tangent is still y over x, so -5 over -3, which we can just cancel out our negative signs and get 3 over 5. Then each one of our trig functions is just going to be the reciprocal. So cosecant would be square root of 34 over -5, secant would be square root of 34 over -3, and cotangent would be the reciprocal tangent, or 3 over 5. So that's how we are going to find the trig function of any angle. We're not actually talking about finding the angle, but finding the ratio that represents a trig function associated with that angle. And now to find the quadrant of each angle, we want to look at our x and our y values. So we know in quadrant 1, x is greater than 0, y is greater than 0, which means all functions are greater than 0, or positive values. In quadrant 2, we know x is less than 0, but y is still greater than 0. So since y is greater than 0, we know that sine and cosecant will also be greater than 0, because r has to be positive and y is positive. Since x is less than 0, we know that cosine and secant, and then as well, since tangent and cotangent have an x value in them, are also going to be less than 0. Okay, quadrant 3, things switch around a little bit. We have x and y both less than 0, which tells us cosine, sine, cosecant, and secant, all of those have just one x and one y, or one y, so they are all going to be less than 0. Now, one thing to keep in mind, tangent and cotangent both have an x and a y, so the two negatives will cancel out, and so tangent and cotangent are both positive in quadrant 3. In quadrant 4, then, we know that x is positive and y is negative, so that tells us that cosine and secant are both greater than 0 or positive, and since y is negative, we know that sine, cosecant, tangent, and cotangent, all of those have to be negative or less than 0. And where we might see this is an example like this, so tangent of theta. So we know that tangent, like we just talked about, is negative in quadrants 2 and quadrants 4. Cosine we know is positive in 1 and 4. So the only quadrant that theta can lie in is the one where they match, where cosine is positive and tangent is negative. That tells us that theta has to be in quadrant 4. Likewise, if we look at another one, if sine is positive, that's going to be in quadrant 1 or 2, and cosine is positive, that's in 1 or 4. That tells us that the only place they match is in quadrant 1, so we know that theta has to lie in quadrant 1. Okay, an extension of an application like that, we can have that cosecant of theta equals -4 and tangent of theta is greater than 0. Well, tangent, remember, is greater than 0 in 1 and 3. Okay, we're going to need that piece of information in a minute. Cosecant of theta, remember, is equal to r over y. So this tells us that r over y equals -4, or probably a better way to write that is -4 over 1. But you need to remember, since r cannot be negative, r in this case actually has to equal 4, and y actually has to equal -1. So what we need to find is x. Well, one trick to keep in mind, since y is negative, the only quadrant that theta can lie in would be 3. Because y is negative, it can't be 1. So we know that theta lies in quadrant 3. Okay, likewise, you see tangent is negative here. So tangent is negative in 2 and 4, and sine is positive in 2 or 1, and so they match in 2. Okay, now taking this one step further, so we know that in quadrant 2, tangent again is going to be y and x. So we don't know r. In quadrant 2, x is negative and y is positive. So that actually tells us that y is not the -1. Y is going to be +1. X is going to be a -3. And so we have to figure out r. We're going to do that by saying 1 squared plus 3 squared is going to give us 10, and so r would be the square root of 10. And now we can figure out cosine, because we know that that is x over r, so that would give us cosine. And we can figure out cosecant by saying that that is r over y, so square root of 10 over 1, and that would give us cosecant. Okay, so those would be two applications of using your quadrant information to find the ratio of an angle. This whole section really was just about how we find a tangent or a trig function, a ratio for a given angle, even if we don't know the angle, based off of what quadrant it is in. Okay, we will see you next time.